Hello, everyone. Welcome to the EVO seminar series. Our guest today is Dr. Joan Strassmann, who does some really interesting research on organismality. That is, when many creatures become one organism, or maybe not. I'm really, really fascinated by this topic, and we're really lucky to have her with us today. So with that, I will leave it to her.
Okay, so I switch to screen share.
Mm-hmm.
And then I switch this to full screen.
Perfect.
Oh, except for that's the very end. Okay, is that good?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So you've read those papers probably, and what I'm going to kind of do today is partly walk you through them and partly see if there's some other interesting things that we can discover about the topic in general. Thought we had it pretty much solved early on, but as time goes on, as we talk to more and more people, I can see that probably organismality is a complex topic and that it depends on what you want to use it for. So here is an organism or 2 million or 5, or just look at this picture and think about how many organisms you might see here. I'm sure you see the magpie. I'm sure you see the garter snake. If these were 2 microbes, the standard microbiology explanation would be that the snake is aiding the magpie, because microbiologists generally can't really see what is going on and what the motivations might be between the organisms. But here, because we know what a snake is and we know what a magpie is, we're really quite sure that altruistic aid is not really a part of this story. There's also the trees, the grasses, the pine cones, some forbs over there on the right. So this is actually a really complex picture that shows one example of an interaction. So when you want to tackle a big topic like what is an organism, we could really start from the very beginning and just ask, why is the genetic code material, DNA or RNA, packaged in organisms? Why isn't it just floating around as it might be in a computer program, but in nature, in the ocean, stuck to rocks and sand? Why should it clump into organisms? Why does this even happen?
Because it needs other machinery to work.
Oh, can you guys talk to me?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Can you all talk? Do you decide who talks? How's it work?
So currently most people have muted microphones, but they can unmute themselves, and then I also will sometimes step in to mute or unmute if we get feedback problems, but anybody can talk when they want to.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So why do we have this? All these carp in a reservoir just going crazy, many organisms in the water. Why isn't the world just like this? Or is life mostly tiny? So I've got a few questions that I really do want a little discussion about, and here's the first one. And I think a way that the discussion can work well is if you look at the question and you write down an answer for yourself. So you sort of think of your own ideas first, then we talk about it a little bit. So what do you suppose, if you're just fishing in the world and you grab a 500 bases of DNA, what organism would it be in? Or would it even be in an organism at all? So why don't you think about that and we can talk about it a little. Well, what do you think? What would it be in?
A cell?
A cell. A free living cell, an amoeba? A cell that's
But
in
yeah, that's
something?
one of them.
Okay. What else might it be in?
I mean, my guess is that it would be in a bacteria because there's probably just much more bacterial DNA floating around than anything else.
Other thoughts? Or anything else? So I guess I'd really like to say is that this is where we should start when we think of organisms, because really what organisms do is they clump DNA at first principles. So you might ask, hang on, I have to let the dog in. Okay, up. Could not sit here and listen to the dog scream the entire time. So, you know, archaea, bacteria, and viruses are so common, so overwhelming, and so ancient. It could be that that's all that we need to consider. So this is life we can't really see, so we tend not to really think about it. Here's a picture of bacteria and viruses in seawater magnified many, many times. So how common are they? If you look just at viruses, in ocean water, you may never go in the ocean again, there's about 10 to the 7th viruses per milliliter. Per milliliter. This is almost inconceivable. So what does that mean? Well, I always like to scale things. So if you think that there's about 7.12 billion humans on Earth, or at least there were when I first made this slide, then there's as many humans on Earth as there are viruses in 712 mils of seawater, or the amount in these 2 bottles. So that's kind of stunning. Or if you want to just take the US population in a couple of tablespoons, hardly a mouthful, there's as many viruses as people in the US population. Or you could go to a much, much bigger scale and ask about bacteria. And in bacteria, there's only about 10 to the 5th bacteria per milliliter. Because before it was, oh no, I haven't. It's the same. Anyway, so in this bottle here of seawater, or if this bottle were filled with seawater, there would be as many bacteria in there as people in the US and Brazil combined. So not only are the numbers really high, but the bacteria on land and sea have a mass greater than all animals and plants. So, you know, people talk about how many insects there are and how much biomass is in insects relative to other animals, but that really pales besides all of the bacteria that are out there. So you could almost say that these organisms that we see are sort of an anomaly to life. These are so common, they have to be a really successful way to live. So why have these bigger organisms even evolved? What are they good at? What makes them successful? I mean, they're out there, we see them. They may be rare, but they're not that rare. So I think to understand this, we really need to know what an organism is. So I'll start here with this picture. What do you see? How many organisms? What do you see here?
I see one. I see one organism that's probably made up of a lot of little organisms, and a stick that's probably made up of different organisms too.
So you see a frog and then a bunch of other stuff, but basically there's a frog. And we know about frogs. They develop from a single cell, they go through a tadpole stage, and then they become frogs. So I think we don't need to have a lot of angst about a frog as an organism. How about here? How many organisms? Someone else. Everyone has to speak, please.
I see 2 on the surface, the spider and the guy.
Yeah, that's actually my son who's about to leave. Yeah, right while I'm doing this, he's moving on to grad school. Anyway, yeah, there's probably also a lot of other organisms on his skin and certainly in his teeth. But yeah, there's two kind of stunning ones. By the way, it's really stupid to put a tarantula on your face because they do shed hairs as defense. How about here? How many organisms? Someone else, one of the ladies.
Mel, you can unmute your microphone.
I'm gonna go for one.
Okay, so you could say one social insect nest. You might say it's problematic because there are solitary wasps and any one of those individuals would be like it. But yeah, you could say one. I would say one. That, by the way, is Polybia ignobilis. It's quite a mean, stinging wasps, and we studied these in Venezuela back when Venezuela was a country you could go to. How about here? What do we see here?
Well, I guess it would be 2 or 3, I guess, because there would be the lichens, the moss, and then the actual wood that it's on.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, there's at least 2 kinds of lichen here. There's or maybe 3, because there's yeah. And lichens, of course, are a symbiosis of fungi plus algae, and they've recently discovered they also have bacteria. No surprise. All right, let's see if this works. How about here? Let's just think about this one. So this is 2 things. One is dyed green, the other is not. They're different clones of Dictyostelium. So yeah, that kind of.
Could you explain what's going on in that picture a little bit?
Well, why don't you tell me what's going on? What are you seeing?
Well, so I'm having. So you told me that it's Dicty, so I know that those are probably multicellular-ish slugs, but I'm not. You said there's two different strains that are dyed green and black, I guess.
One's dyed green, the other is unstained. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'm having difficulty identifying in the image the unstained ones.
Well, they look black.
Okay.
So are they mixing? Is there a solidity to one organism, this little black guy coming along, or this one that's kind of bicolored, it goes over another one and just sucks it in? It was really supposed to kind of mess with your head in terms of.
What is the time scale that's happening on? How sped up is this?
How sped up is it? It's fairly sped up, but it would be anywhere from 20 minutes to 4 hours. So not like super sped up. Anyway, it's just going to make it tough. So now what I'd like you to think about is just write down, make a list for yourself, and then we can talk just a little about what are the essential characteristics. What does it take to be an organism? I've shown you some bacteria and archaea. I've shown you some other things I call organisms. I've shown you that Dicty. Just write down some things. If you had to teach say a 5th grade class and tell the students what an organism is, what is a robust definition that will work on any new life form. If they go to Mars, they'll be able to say, oh, that's an organism. That's a group of organisms. That's a part of an organism. What are these essential characteristics?
The ability to reproduce.
The ability to reproduce, okay. What else?
It must interact with its environment and the factors in it.
Must interact with the environment. Okay, what else?
Must have some sort of genetic coding to define itself.
Okay, genetic uniformity. What else?
I would say maybe it's a to some degree self-determining, self-replicating open system, but then
Wait, an open system would not be self-determining. Are you saying closed system?
well, it's sort of an open system because it's got interaction, right? It's got information exchange with its surroundings and fellow organisms all the time, right? But then there's, to some degree, it's self-enclosed. So
it interacts with others, but it has some boundary, maybe.
yeah, but its boundary is sort of is like semi-permeable, whatever kind of boundary that is.
Right. Okay. Others.
The word that I want to use there, which of course doesn't actually get us anywhere, but Mel used it, is self, right? Like I think that's the critical feature, is like however we want to define self, that there's some sort of like functional continuity of all the parts, I guess would be one way to put it.
Okay. Other thoughts? Okay, we can move on. So I'd say basically it's really hard to decide what is an organism. I mean, this is obviously a mallard. It's a male mallard. It's an organism, you might say. Can't reproduce on its own. It needs a female mallard to reproduce, but there you go. It came from a single egg. So as you know, are you guys seeing the whole slides? I have this little thing on the bottom.
Well, what I can see of the current slide is it has the publication information at the bottom, and it has the social, what does it say? I can put it up here. A logical definition of organism at the top, and the citation information at the bottom.
Oh, it shows both citations in full.
Yes.
Oh, I guess there's a little thing that I can hide. Yeah, I just hide that. Oops. What happened?
You've gone back into Hangouts.
Uh-oh.
No, your screen share is still on. You're not in PowerPoint anymore.
Okay, that's not good. There.
There you
Is that better? Okay. All right, so Dave came up with this definition of an organism, and then together we've worked on this topic quite a bit. So we're trying to identify an organism really for the purpose of understanding an evolutionary adaptive unit. And we say that what makes an organism is that there's high cooperation among the parts and low actual conflict. And this means that the level of life that we call an organism is sort of the unit of selection that adaptation works at. And so that the parts have near unanimous interests. And this is kind of vague and abstract, so I'm going to try to work through it. So it's the thing that we use to say how life went from viruses and bacteria to us. And the basic idea is when the parts clump together into a new form, the conflict is enough suppressed that they can cooperatively do things, and larger things do a lot of things better. They move faster, they can beat out other smaller things, lots of things. So that's the basic idea. So these collaboration among the parts lets them become more successful. So in doing this, we sort of had to deconstruct cooperation and conflict in a different way. People generally think of high cooperation as the opposite of high conflict on sort of one linear scale. And so what we would like to say is that actually the opposite of high cooperation is no cooperation, and the opposite of high conflict is low conflict, and they're not the same. And I can just show you how we do that. So we have just a divide space this way, with one axis going from high cooperation to low cooperation, and the other going from more to less conflict. And we sort of put the axes this way so that the mores are on the left, so we could have organisms in the upper right. And then we just, this is really a heuristic. It's not a quantitative sort of measure where we can divide all of life into organisms, societies, competitors, and simple groups. So let's start with sort of the perspective of what this might mean for cells. So here, and again, I said this is not quantitative, this is just sort of kind of guesses, really. So we want to put things we know are organisms in the organismality camp, because otherwise we're kind of screwing with the language. So whales, mice, worms, redwoods, and those sorts of animal and plant things that we all would recognize as 5-year-olds as organisms fit in that camp. The issues with organisms really don't come from that kind of organism. They come from all of the rest of life that people just don't think about as much. So I'll show you a few examples. So there's what your whale, mouse, nematode, largely organismal, high cooperation, high conflict among the cells that make it up. And here I'm not talking about the bacteria and stuff. Marmosets are a little more complicated. So we scooched them down slightly because they have this weird mating system where fraternal twins are chimeric, that there's just some tissue that moves between them. So it's really kind of weird, makes them slightly less organismal. Tasmanian devil, as you know, has this contagious facial cancer that came from one. It's cells of, it's Tasmanian devil cells, but they're from some long dead Tasmanian devil that is now sort of colonizing the living ones. I think recently there's been some resistance to it, but it kind of slots Tasmanian devils away from full organismality. Dictyostelium that we work on, largely organismal, definitely in the organism camp, but it has issues because it forms by aggregation that push it sort of down and away from full organismality. Okay, then we can look at...
Pause there just because I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the Dictyostelium life cycle. Could you just summarize that briefly?
Sure. So Dictyostelium is what I work on. I work on it because when it's hungry, it's forms an aggregation that's multicellular. So in this cartoon, so most of the time they're just free-living amoebae. They eat, they divide. They're eukaryotes, so they're like us. When they starve, they aggregate, and different clones can aggregate together. They then crawl through the forest floor as slugs, and then ultimately form a fruiting body in which about 20% of them die. So they have an altruism stage, and that can also involve cheating. So they're kind of cool. They ought to be, because I've spent 20 years studying them. So we might talk more about them, might not. So then there's the Volvocene algae, and something like Volvox up there at the top, which forms a complex multicellular body with certain cells. The bigger ones are the ones that are reproductive, but they're all together and they move around. Then Gonium forms simple, undifferentiated groups of, I think, 16 cells. and then Chlamydomonas is solitary. So they sort of span that axis of cooperative but not very organismal. Biofilms. There's lots of different kinds of biofilms. These are multi-species agglomerations on surfaces. If any of you make kombucha, does anyone make kombucha?
Yeah, I actually, if you go back on the EvoTivo archives, there's a video of a class that I taught on kombucha making and other fermentation things.
Oh, cool. Well, I love fermented stuff. We make kombucha, and there's the SCOBY that is certainly a multicellular thing, and you see this blobby stuff here. These are generally polysaccharides and other things released by the cells, which can be viewed either as competitive or cooperative. But in general, cooperation is not high in biofilms. And actually, this is something that nearly every microbiologist gets wrong. They just don't get how evolution applies to what they do. Okay, so we first did groups of cells. We can now do groups of multicellular individuals. And this is actually something I spent the first 25 or so years of my career on, was mostly Polistes wasps. So here you have things that you might know, lots of different organisms that probably make sense to you. So looking over in the organismal camp, we have honeybees as more organismal than stingless bees for reasons we'll talk about later. Portuguese man-of-war has all those little units that are really they call them a colony, but they're functionally an organism. Anglerfish mates. Anyway, I'll show you some of these. So there's the Portuguese man-of-war, and they say they're really a colony made up of many organisms. It's clearly one organism. It does stuff all together, and it just happens that the little units that it made up of phylogenetically have as connections to things that don't clump all together. Aphid clone, it's a group. It's not really they don't really fight, so it's over there to the right. They don't cooperate too much, except for since these are pink, if they're on a distasteful plant, and the red coloring might, if one is eaten and is found distasteful, it might protect the others from further predation. Not very cooperative. Honeybees, highly cooperative. I would call them organismal. They're all working for the queen, who does most of the reproduction. Okay, then here's some groups that I'd say are not really organismal. Naked mole rats, Polistes wasps. You can see they have yellow and green paint marks on them. African hunting dogs. They're quite organismal, but there's so much conflict within the groups that I say that pushes them over towards societies, which are actually perhaps the most fascinating things to study. I'd say humans are not organismal. Here at the top is some big city, which is way less organismal than this Dogon village that my sister has studied for the last 30 years. Highly cooperative, but also tons of within group conflict. Brain flukes in an ant. So this is not the relation of the brain flukes and the ant, but the brain flukes in the ant. So some are in the brain, others are in other parts of the body. So the ones that are in the brain go to the brain, make the ant do certain things that are beneficial to the others, and then the brain ones die, and the ones in the gut are the ones that then pass on. So there's a high level of cooperation there among them. They're largely clonal, but not entirely. Anglerfish. Turn on the fan. So anglerfish mates, these are so cool. So the bottom picture is the male, And all the male does is he hunts for a female. The top picture is a female. He hooks into her right in front of her gonadal opening, and then his whole circulatory system fuses with hers, and all he does is pump out sperm periodically and fertilize her eggs. So this is a level of mate cooperation that is far greater than what we see in humans.
So I have a question about that one. So there's this really dramatic fusion, right? Like we see the fusion of tissues, and that immediately gives us this intuition of like, oh, something special is going on here. But the reproductive requirements of these anglerfish aren't really that different from any other sexual species, in that you always have to find a mate. So what besides the fusion, what makes this relationship more organismal than other fish mating or monogamous birds or something?
Well, what makes it different is it's entirely monogamous. His life is entirely dependent on this one female. There's no chance for either of them to survive without the other. So that's the real difference, is their fates are completely intertwined. So
it's monogamy. That's the key here, is that it's the mate fidelity is so well guaranteed, and you don't really see that in other animals.
Yes, and it's also the fact that his nutrition comes from her. He has no other options.
It's monogamy plus codependence, Maximus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, extreme codependence. I like it. Yeah. So then there's some other things that are actually genetically identical and don't really have any conflict, but they don't really do anything for each other either. So the dandelions in this country, they're all clonal. They don't reproduce sexually. Strawberries have these connections. So they're not really, they're not competing, but they're not really cooperating. So they're not really organisms together. So then going through these things, two species groups, these might be viewed as more controversial somewhat. Let's just look at a few of these. So this is the one everyone talks about, the mitochondrion and its eukaryote hosts. Their fates are pretty much tied, although the genetic interests of mitochondria and their sexual hosts are not identical, and we do know quite a bit about conflicts in those sorts of conditions. There's an aphid, Buchnera, symbiosis, where the aphid has special cells that take up the bacteria, and they can't really digest their sugars without the Buchnera. The Buchnera makes certain amino acids. They're good at processing the sugars that the aphids take in. There's endophytes in grasses, more horizontally transmitted, although not entirely, but they're fairly organismal. The endophyte takes some of the plant's carbon, but gives it a lot of protection against herbivores. Then there's the famous example of lichens, which are collaborations between algae and fungi. And I think, 10% or so of all fungi are lichenized. It's not a single origin thing. It's arisen lots of times, and there's also lots of algae that are involved. They don't necessarily co-speciate, so if you look at the lineages of algae and the fungi that are lichenized, they're not necessarily the same. They can reproduce in sort of reproductive sorts of ways, since they are eukaryotes, but they can also just have chunks break off and be passed on as a way of replicating. There's the famous squid vibrio case. I don't know if they're organismal or not. You might say they're sort of close to the line. They're not vertically transmitted. When they go into the squid, they go into these special chambers, and any one chamber has only one clone of Vibrio, which keeps the Vibrio from fighting among themselves. Figs and fig wasps. The fig is totally dependent on these fig wasps for pollination, and it's just a super rich story of how this works. Cleaner fish and clients, not organismal. The fish are often very tempted to take a little bite out of the cleaners take bites out of the fish. Not a good idea. And then that's also kind of, you can look at it from the point of view of the group of the cleaners, that if one cleaner takes a bite out of a fish they're cleaning, that kind of screws it for the rest of the cleaners. So this is a really cool system. And then yeah.
Just about the, is there been any research elaborating that of, you know, different species that are more or less parasitic, and if they evolve under certain ecological circumstances?
Yeah, there's a ton of research. Roald Bashary, Bshary, is one of the people you would look for. But yeah, it's a very well-studied system.
Cool.
And then there's things like this, which, you know, nobody would really say that the gazelle flung itself into the jaws of the lion to help it. It was just, this is not cooperation. Although if these were two microbes, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that. So I always say, if you're working on microbes, you need to understand what you don't understand and be a little humble.
So I guess it's that codependence thing. Like, what's the difference between a lion eating an antelope and a human eating a sheep, right? I mean, they're both predatory, but in the one hand, we tend to call domestication a kind of mutualism because we're controlling their reproductive cycle.
We're continuing their lineage. Yeah, you could say that. Yes. I mean, a lion is just hunting the gazelle and killing it. If we're farming and rearing crops and then eating some of the results, the reproductive success of the sheep and the adaptations of the sheep could be, you know, benefited by humans. But yeah, that's a huge complex topic, and you're right, it's the cooperation that makes it somewhat different, complicated. Okay, so just to sort of recap the basic idea that high cooperation and low conflict aren't the same, and that you can have organismic levels of cooperation but high conflict, which I'd say human societies, maybe some biofilms would fit in that category. Or you can have an organismic lack of conflict but not really much cooperation, which would be aphid clones, gonium, strawberries with runners between them and things like that. So you can get organismal cooperation from societies by reduction of conflict, as you might for the honeybees. You can get it from simple groups by adding cooperation, or you can get it from antagonists by altering both, as endosymbionts could start as pathogens and then move to the organismal category. So one of the things that this perspective has really forced us to do is to study a lot of organisms that just aren't the things you learned about in kindergarten. They're just all these other things out there, and life mostly takes bizarre forms, and we don't really much think about them. All right, so I've sort of given you our sort of new idea. We've talked around what's in organisms. It's kind of really weird. I mean, there's organismal biology is a thing, but if you really ask people to define what it is, it's just not that well defined.
Well, organismal biology is membrane-bounded biology, isn't it, basically?
Okay, that might be one definition. Here is some of the characteristics that are out there in the literature as to what an organism is. And this sort of holds also with what an individual is. Organismality and individuality sort of blend. So, and this is a Leonardo da Vinci picture of man. So functional integration, that the parts all work together. You know, if you want to run, you run. You don't kind of fall over. Your legs don't go in different directions if you're lucky. Physical contiguity, indivisibility. So you have to be physically contiguous, one thing, not divided. Uniform, genetic uniformity. You have to develop from a single cell. And this, of course, would give you genetic uniformity and probably indivisibility, give you some of the others. Genetic co-transmission, some of these you guys mentioned at the beginning. Membership in the same species is viewed as essential by a lot of people. Often there's a germ-soma separation. So what this means is the germline and the body are separated so that the germline can sort of be sequestered and kept pure and from the interests of the other tissues. And then you can't just be coming and going from one organism to another. So this is sort of the paradigm definition. And I would say this works for what I'm calling the kindergarten organisms, you know, the whale, the mouse, the tree. But it just doesn't work for most of life. And I'll just sort of take apart some of these things. Physical contiguity. I think really nobody would argue honeybee colonies are not organismal, and yet they're not contiguous. The brain flukes in an ant, also not contiguous. Albatross mates. Albatrosses are not as hooked together as the anglerfish, but they do mate for life, and they're very devoted to one another. Don't have extra pair copulations. So that's physical contiguity. Indivisibility. Again, the honeybee colony is made up of parts that are separate. Squid and Vibrio are too. Genetic uniformity. Lots of things we'd call organisms are not genetically uniform, and here are just 5 that we've talked about before. They don't have to develop from a single cell or be members of the same species. Here's the mitochondrial host, aphid buchnera, grass endophytes. They don't have to be genetically co-transmitted. So really what I've tried to do is completely trash the sort of traditional definition of an organism and replaced it with the new definition. So I guess I'd like you to just take a minute or two and maybe just make a note for yourself about what you think about this. What are the problems with the new definition? What are the problems with the old one? Just what do you think? And then we'll talk a little bit, but just try to figure out what you think before we start talking. So what are your thoughts? Can we just hear from every student in turn, please?
Yeah, sure. That's good. Can we start with Mel, and then we'll move down, and I'll conclude.
I'm muted, aren't I?
Yes.
Great. So I'm trying to remember, what is it? Family relations? Maximus, help me out. When you have similarities, I forget whose name it is on that, Family Relations. So you can't draw a bright line distinction. You can't narrow it down to essential.
Are you talking about Wittgenstein's definition of a game?
I might be.
There's a bundle of characteristics that are none. They're not going to be universally shared, but if enough of them are shared, you can draw a circle around it and say, okay, that's the thing.
That's probably exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah. So that was sort of the tentative conclusion that I came to when I was first puzzling over these issues of organismality a year ago, was that was probably the best we were going to get.
So something that you can draw a line around?
Just that we can find an exception to each of these rules, to each of these criteria. But if enough criterion are met, then there may be like a minimum number of criteria that conjoined allow us to draw that distinction in organismality.
Okay, that's a good point.
We hear from David. David might be having bandwidth trouble. What about Heather?
Hey, you know what? I don't really want to make this painful.
Can you hear me?
Oh, no.
Yeah, there's Joan. There's a little bit of lag, but like if we are patient, we will hear from people. Yeah, Heather, we did hear you.
Cell bottleneck. So like I feel like it's singling out the things, as opposed to the new definition is like it says a constellated bundle. So it's giving you more like a broader sense.
I think we missed the first part of what you said.
Basically, the older definition is like more strict and singled in on certain things, and then gives you a more broad technology and stuff, and realize there are more organisms and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I think that the two definitions converge on the most traditional organisms, and that there are life forms that the old definition won't cover. I also think that our definition, it's not black and white, that if you see something, you can definitely say which it is without a thorough study. And then I also think that it's a gradient, that you can be more or less organismal. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the critical thing, is recognizing that this is indeed a gradient. Like, I think that we have these intuition. I mean, that's why I said that thing earlier about like organismal biology is membrane-bounded biology, is that like we have this.
I have no idea what you mean by that. Do you mean that it's cell adhesion molecules?
I meant just that like the people that call themselves organismal biologists study things that you can point to that are contiguous. That it like not that they like demand that definition, but that's functionally what it is. Is like there are organisms that are easy to define, and that's because they are similar to us in their size and in their way that they're built. But that's a bias. That's just an anthropocentric.
I don't think that's. I mean, yeah, maybe we shouldn't argue about this because I really don't agree with that.
Okay.
Anyway, I mean, an organismal biologist could study squid, for example. But anyway.
Yeah. Maybe I'm being a little bit too bombastic. I meant mostly that like we have an intuition that says that organisms are membrane bound, and it's not like one that's maybe critically examined, but just like if you ask a small child, Like that's like if you can point to it, if you can pick it up, if you can trace its outline, like the physical thing of like whether it's bounded or not, whether it's not a beehive as opposed to a bee, that seems to have a lot of importance for us conceptually.
So you mean by membrane, you mean skin?
I mean connected.
Huh?
And one piece.
Oh, that's not what I would mean by membrane. Membrane kind of a specific meaning. Anyway.
All right.
Other students want to chime in, or do you want to wait?
I do. I think this is all really interesting. I haven't really read much about this before this lecture. I'll end the homeworks, but it's really cool. It's like a good step up from the old definition, because if you read the old definition, it's got all these different things that it's trying to include in order to make it a sound definition, and it doesn't always work still for some of those other superorganisms and stuff where everything might not be connected, or you get different types of cells or stuff. So this new definition is really cool. It's a different way of looking at organisms and defining it a little bit better than the old complicated definition with indivisibility and genetic uniformity and all this, just to try to get a solid definition for something that we think is simple.
Okay, good. Other comments?
I think my microphone is working now.
Cool.
I agree with John, definitely. I think the main point that I get out of it, if I were trying to maybe like expand on what the point of the new definition compared to the old definition, in my opinion, would be that the new definition encompasses a broader spectrum. So it allows you, like, organismality can be spread around or can be applied to more organisms rather than the previous definition, which was more specific in its wording and what it was looking for. So it almost is expanding the amount that you could look into, research, etc.
Okay. Well, that's what we hope. Other comments?
I'm starting to question what is not an organism. So the internet, technology, is that an organism?
So you might say all of life is in one or another. All DNA is in an organism, say. So then what organismality, in our view, does is tries to delineate the unit that adaptation, that natural selection works on, that it's the unit where the sub-interests are subsumed into the common good. I'll explain that a little more in a bit, but I'd like to hear if anyone else has something they want to say.
Am I muted now? No, I'm not. I had a really interesting experience yesterday. I was trying very hard to weed a garden, and it was just a mess of things, a very intermingled mess of things going everywhere, and some things had spread far beyond the boundary of where I thought that they should have, and some things were like clustering together, and I really had this feeling that I was on the top of a tree, like on the very outer.
Cool. Yeah.
But that it was many intermingled trees, so that there were many branch lines coming up and intermingling. But then it was this realization of, oh, that's what we're doing. We are on this very outward perimeter of the foliage of these long intermingling lines of phylogeny. And
yeah. So yes, with the plants, you can ask, how does the carbon move around? Does it, if one branch gets sun and another one's in shade, does the carbon move to the shaded one or not? And you can look at it also in terms of biological markets, which we've done in another paper, where you look at both the plant and all its different branches, and then the mycorrhizae, say, that feed it nitrogen, and it's this big, huge carbon for nitrogen or phosphorus in case of mycorrhizae market. And yeah, weeding a garden is a really educational experience. I tend to use a hoe, which sort of destroys things. Other comments? Who's got the sparrow, the house sparrow?
Yeah, probably me.
Cool.
Got a bird feeder out here.
Oh, nice. All right, I'll move on a bit. I'm really trying not to be dogmatic with this and to, I guess, point out all the amazing, crazy organisms that are out there and offer a definition that if you're studying the, natural selection and what it works on, that deciding the organism is the unit that where interests are essentially as common as they can be. So I then wanted to talk about sort of some of the other where you can go with this. And so in our second paper, we had this kind of Baroque figure with what organismality is in the middle, and then on the left are factors that favor it, and then the outcome. So I'll just start here with looking at the outcome. So the outcome is an adapted organism. It's likely to have a division of labor, and this could be that your liver and your kidney are doing different jobs, or it could be that there's workers and queens. There's definitely subordination of the interests of the parts to the whole. Development has to be coordinated in some way, even if it's between species and not all the same, under the same skin. Reproduction also has to be coordinated. There has to be some kind of homeostasis, and there's likely to be indivisibility at some level. So here you actually see that the results of the selective factors favoring organismality often result in the kinds of things that other earlier people used to define it. So then looking over to the left, looking at factors favoring organismality, kinds of things, cooperation that you get. And here I sort of break it into fraternal and egalitarian. This is from a Queller paper. It was actually a book review, but it cited a ton. And it was a review of Maynard Smith and Sathmari's Major Transitions book, where Dave divided transitions into the fraternal ones, which are same species related individuals, with the egalitarian ones, which are different species doing different things or different types. So with synergy, you can have accelerated returns. A group can do more than an individual. Egalitarian, you can have complementary functions, the way with the aphid and the Buchnera. With the accelerated returns would be like the wild hunting dogs can, as a group, bring down bigger prey. And there's lots of other examples. Common reduction with fraternal, there could be clonality, kin recognition, keeping out the others. Egalitarian, the mitochondria co-replication, and partner fidelity feedback, where you gear your cooperation and reproduction towards others. And then the last one is conflict resolution. And I'm going to spend the most time on this one because it's really important. And I think really neglected in biology, how important conflict is, how it's resolved. You can have a majority party with power. You can have power apportioned among committees. committees, for example, could be tissues so that, you know, your kidney can do things that other things can't. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that one. So I'll go on. So, of course, have any of you actually read Machiavelli?
I've read that quote a dozen times.
Right. Have any of you read the book? The book is actually really worth reading. And I mean, you see this quote all the time, and Machiavelli is kind of equated to the devil. Actually, the book is really interesting and I think really worth reading, and not what you think. And I think its purpose was not what we think, but hear this, whether it is better to be loved than feared or the reverse. Yeah. Anyway, so taking that to biology, I'd say it's generally wrong, but sometimes power can cement cooperation and can keep potential conflict from turning into actual conflict. So this is actually a point that I should have made earlier, but I didn't. And that is that our whole perspective on organismality is about actual conflict and its control, and not potential conflict. So what does that mean? I mean, potential conflict is essentially anytime you have individuals with different interests in a situation, they might conflict. So power can be the importance of a given interaction to the survival and interests of the individual. And this is what Dawkins calls the life dinner principle, where the rabbit generally runs faster than the fox because the rabbit is running for his life while the fox is only running for his dinner. So this is the life dinner principle. There's been some controversy around it because, of course, if the fox, or in this case, the cheetah, never got a dinner, then, you know, it would have the terrible consequences. So this is how important it is to you. This is something that comes up in animal behavior a lot, where certain individuals will fight more for what they want than others. There's Egbert Lee's famous Parliament of the Genes, where he argues that selfish traits like meiotic drive. So meiotic drive is where, say you have a certain gene on a certain chromosome, if it has a way of always getting into the next generation and not the other allele at its locus, that would be meiotic drive. And so the drive gene, if it carries any cost, it gains, all other loci lose. That means any allele at any other locus that stopped the drive would be favored. And so natural selection should essentially favor the genes that stop things, because all of the genes' interests are in favor of that, and only one gene is in favor of itself being a driving gene. So things like this can make predictions that driving genes will crop up. They should be short-lived. I mean, there's lots of predictions, and this is, again, a huge field in biology. Another kind of power comes from the ability to actually control what happens. This has been studied a ton in social insects. So there's the collective, which polices if a worker lays eggs and it's not in other workers' interest to have those eggs reared, they can just eat them. There's physical strength, power of physical strength, where if there's large differences in size or strength, some individuals can force others not to, say, reproduce in the group, and then their best option can become to cooperate. Power of first strike, and this is, if you look at honeybees and stingless bees, they're quite closely related. Stingless bees are closest to bumblebees, but still they're fairly close. So honeybee queens are reared in larger cells. They get different food, and really workers don't become queens. Stingless beans like Melipona, not all stingless beans, but say Melipona, the queens are reared in the same size cells as the workers, and they get the same amount of food, and they're not progressively fed. They get a huge bolus of food, and then the cell's sealed. So then essentially each individual can decide essentially whether they become a queen or a worker. So do you see any differences in those 10 or so heads? See any differences in those bees, in those larvae? What do you see? I'll tell you there's 3 queens in that picture, queen larvae.
Is it the yellowish ones?
Is that Maximus?
Yeah.
You are talking too much.
Okay.
Sorry. The yellowish ones, do I have any more bets from the more eagle-eyed students? There's 3.
Do some of them have smaller black spots than others?
True. Okay, those black spots are eyes. So the future queens have smaller eyes. Very good. And 2 of them do also happen to be yellowish. So that is way too many queens for this colony to be rearing. And so what happens when they hatch out is they stretch their wings. They feel so good. They say, I'm queen. I'm a young virgin queen. And I've just been emerged as an adult. And the other workers come over and say, yep, you don't have corbicula. You can't carry pollen. We don't need a new queen. You are useless. And they chop her head off. And that's what you see in the bottom picture. And this happens to like a quarter of the Melipona larvae emerging. It's a huge waste from the level of the colony. These could have all been workers going off, getting pollen, getting honey, and helping the colony thrive. But these selfish interests result in this huge conflict of interest. Honeybees, far fewer cells. I mean, the larva doesn't get to decide. It's either reared as a queen or not. So it's much more peaceful. I will tell you though, honeybee queens, honeybees so cooperative, honeybee queens actually have a stinger. Unlike the workers, so that why would they have a stinger? They never go out and forage. What do they need it for? Well, it turns out the honeybee stinger is not barbed. So, you know, workers, they have the barbed stinger, they sting you, they die, they leave their stinger in you and they die, and it's horrible for them. The queen has an unbarbed stinger. It's used for only one thing. Do you know what that is? Does anyone know what the honeybee queen uses her stinger for? I'll tell you.
Don't tell us. Let somebody answer.
Any guesses?
This is a very cool story.
I think everyone should guess. Chime in really quick.
You start.
Me, killing disobedient workers.
Killing disobedient workers. Okay, that's a great guess. Other thoughts? I mean, that has several components. You've taken into account it's unbarbed, so she could sting multiple times. She could just go around and sting disobedient workers. Okay, other thoughts? You know what? I'm just going to go on. So the honeybee queen, so you see that cell, that queen cell, the melipona, about a quarter of them become queens, way more than they need. The honeybees, those queens take a long time to make. They can't really, and they at least in north temperate regions, they have a new colony cycle every year. They can't make just one because if that cell, something happens to it. So they make, 3 or 4 per hive. So the first one to emerge comes out, hunts down the other queen cells, and stings her sisters to death through the cells. How cool is that? That's what she does. If they hatch out, they will sting. They might even sting each other to death. But that is what the queen stinger is for. Very cool.
What do we know about the phylogeny of these two kinds of bees? Is the stingless bee basal or derived?
Anything alive today is derived, right?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So melipona is related to bumblebees first, but they're all in the apiny. We're not going to be able to say one is more advanced than the other, anything like that.
I guess is it that eusociality evolved with this sort of like single queen orderly adaptations, and then the multiple queen thing came later? Or no? Okay, it's the other way.
Well, neither, right? I mean, we don't know.
Well, I mean, they come from solitary bees, and there's the melipona and the honeybees and the bumblebees are all from a social lineage of bees, not solitary bees. But there's a rich literature on this topic. We were actually among the first to point out these differences with the melipona and the conflicts of interest. But yeah, it's super cool. All right, here's the power of the last move. The queen gets to decide what sex egg she lays, but then the workers are there feeding the young and they can eat the eggs. So worker interests tend to prevail over queens. Another example of that is these melipona bees. Sometimes when these are almost ready to hatch, but the melipona fills the cell with honey and pollen, a mixture of vomited out mixture, and then the queen lays an egg in there. Sometimes a worker will come along, sneak in, lay her own worker egg in there, and her egg would become a male. Then that male develops faster, hunts down the slowly developing female larva, kills her, and then a male hatches out. I mean, social insects are amazing. They're just so cool.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So, this has been bothering me. I didn't quite get it. Is the sex strategy in the mellifera versus the melipona different?
Is which strategy different?
The sex determination strategy.
The sex determination?
Yeah.
No, it's the same. So, I mean, this is a whole different lecture, but honeybees and melipona are all social insects, except for termites, are what we call, all Hymenoptera actually, ants, bees, and wasps, are what we call haplodiploid. And so what that means is the males are haploid, the females are diploid, and so this has all kinds of implications to relatedness. So sisters, since the queens generally mate only once, although not in honeybees, then sisters are what we call super sisters, related quarters. Anyway, so yeah, the sex determination is basically if you're homozygous at several sex determining loci, you're male. And basically it's because you're haploid, you're male. And if you're diploid, you're female. So There's a huge literature on this. They're super cool.
Thanks.
Sure. Power of the last move, power of information. This one's really fascinating. One thing is we talk about is things like the veil of ignorance and stuff for fairness that comes from social science literature. If workers can't tell sisters from brothers, they can't fight with the queen over the sex ratio. And actually they can tell in a lot of cases, but slave ants that are captured as pupae and then brought into a different species colony, they can't tell. They cooperate only because they seemingly can't tell they're in a foreign colony. The dog can't decide if he wants to be in here with me or not. Okay, there's power of possessions. Workers find the food in social insects, but the young can only get the food from the workers. Could be really important in mutualisms where legumes possess carbon and then the rhizobia have nitrogen, and then how they're exchanged depends at least partly on who's got what. So in our own studies of organismality, we've mostly worked on this species, Dictyostelium discoideum, where it's still flexible. And so, you know, if you want to study something, you want to study something where the answer isn't set in stone. You know, if you want to study bipedalism, costs and benefits, you're going to try to find something where it's not everything's bipedal because you can't figure it out. Same thing with organismality. So I think I'll sort of wrap it up here and just remind you that most of life is in organisms that are really not much bigger than the DNA replicators that they contain. So I think I'll just wrap it up there. Good? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a wonderful talk. It was great. Yeah, so if you turn off your screen share, yep, there we go. So we can have a bit of a question and answers. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Strassmann?
Joan, please.
Joan.
I'll ask a question. I'm curious how, I know this is probably the most annoying question for biologists, but how does this relate to social research? And like, you know, because I mean, some of these things I'm thinking about, you talking about the Machiavellian love versus fear principles, and I'm like, okay, these are strategies for me as a middle school teacher. And then you're talking about power of strength, power of first strike. I'm like, okay, these are just like basic fundamental prison rules. Like, okay, this is how you survive. You know what I mean? So I hate to burden you with the focusing on the most important species, which is always the human species, when we're talking about all these other different types of organisms. But there's some strong connections there, and I don't know if that's something that you want to touch on or if that's not interesting. But it's definitely the first thing that comes to mind.
So I'll tell you what. I am a biologist. I work on social evolution in animals. I actually come from a family of social scientists, and I am constantly told, you know, what I'm allowed to talk about and what I'm not. So my husband and I were visiting professors at University of Miami, and we had to give like 4 talks, and one of mine was on women in science. And so my daughter's a sociologist. She's at Chicago. She mostly studies suicide. And I told her, I said, Anna, I have to give a talk on women in science. What should I read? She just said, Mom, you are not qualified to talk about that. And I actually agree with her, because just because I am a woman in science doesn't mean I know the scientific literature about being a woman in science, which is the field of social scientists. So I get really cranky when people like me act like they know something about humans and social science unless they've studied it, because, you know, we don't. So what I would say is, you know, I like stuff like, I like Dan Ariely, I like Kahneman and Tversky, and I just love the social scientists that work on, I like, you know, even Steve Pinker. I like the people that work on, more than anything, I like the people that work on how we don't really understand what our motivations are very well at all. And there's just all these cool studies that they do. And, you know, so what are my opinions worth on humans? You know, I read the New York Times and the New Yorker, and that's, you know, so yeah, it's just not, it's not my field. And unlike most biologists, I understand that there is actually a field out there and I'm not in it. So
Yeah.
sorry.
Way to dodge the question.
I'm not dodging it. I'm being really honest.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. That's fine. That's kind of what I expect, though, too, because I don't know. I feel like, I forget which one of our speakers talked about it, but maybe even our first one, and just saying, like, you know, maybe people who are outside of biology like me are constantly trying to relate to the human species or from these microorganisms and how their behavior relates to our behavior, and maybe there is no correlation. I don't know.
Well,
Right.
I mean, we want to say things that are accurate, and it's really hard to say things that are accurate. But I mean, I think there is something that can be said. Like, we look at all of these mechanisms, like those power slides were really fantastic, and showing all the ways that these things do get managed. And it does seem to me that there are at least principles that could be derived about how we can make human groups work better, that you could see in how insect colonies work and things like that.
But there's always this is-ought confabulation that
Mhm.
occurs in mind.
What do you mean?
Like, we always end up trying to draw norms from that, trying to draw some kind of normative valuation from that implicitly, and as much as we can, I think.
Yeah, and we don't know very much. I mean, have you guys read any of Dan Ariely? Do you know him? He's a Israeli behavioral economist, and he just does fantastic work on what our true motivations are, and on just really fascinating stuff. He's almost like I think he has an app even. So if I were to cognitively try to say anything about any of oh, well, we should do X, Y, or Z, you know, let's understand us. Like, all of us, for example, are such incredible racists, and it is so hardwired into us. We have to understand that before we can cognitively overcome it. You know, so he talked about an experiment where they had a class of students and they gave half green pencils and half red pencils, just referred to the color of the pencils a few times, like no big deal, just referred to them, and then had Confederates who had either green or red pencils give a short PowerPoint talk that was supposed to do certain things, and these talks were designed to be like identical. And you know, the green pencil person gets up there, gives their talk showing their green pencil, and all the green pencil people rate that talk higher than the yellow pencil or the red pencil person. So it's like, you know, there's so much cool work out there by social scientists on humans and our own ability to fool ourselves. I'm not, as a biologist, gonna come in when I haven't done those studies, you know. I mean, my daughter works on the social contagion factors important in suicide. You know, she's going to figure out stuff relevant to suicide way before you could ever draw any evolutionary principles from it. So, yeah. I'm really good at what I do, but I'm also really good at understanding what I don't do. So, yeah. Other questions? You guys ready to go eat lunch? Oh, you probably already ate lunch.
Ask something else. It strikes me. I've been thinking a lot about
You're freezing.
how
You're freezing. You're freezing. Turn your video off. You
Okay,
don't-
so we have some feedback problems. I'm going to mute Joan while
who else is talking?
it's my.
Ah!
Okay, go ahead now.
Was someone else trying to talk? Was it just me? Was it just me talking over myself? Excellent. Perfect. Okay. So I've been thinking a lot about with life and consciousness and behavioral complexity, all these things we like, emerging at the apex of the right trade-off between like order and chaos, or stability and plasticity. So you have all these stability plasticity dilemmas or order chaos dilemmas, and the apex you get like complexity, and you get all these emergent properties in life that you like, or that we like because, you know, us. But it's occurring to me that cooperativity and competition are maybe another of these trade-offs, and we might exist at the balance of that, and so we favor that balance, maybe. Anyways, I guess I'm asking, does cooperativity and competition, is that another of those trade-offs that equilibrates?
So as far as what is an organism, I might say that cooperation and competition are not necessarily alternatives, that you can have high cooperation and high competition, or high cooperation is the opposite, is no cooperation, not high conflict. And that if you start, I really started trying to think that probably there's a whole lot of things that we think of as differences on one line when they're really kind of an X, that they, you know, you can look at, and probably you can look at them in more dimensions than that. But anyway, yeah. Anyone else?
I had kind of a more specific question. My favorite example in this whole talk that you gave was lichens, and I was wondering are they considered organisms with the old definition? Because they're not genetically uniform and they are divisible, sort of. But with the new definition that you talked about, they should be called organisms. I think you would call them organisms. So I was wondering if you know like what they're considered old and new. How do you think about that?
I think people probably they're on the fence even with the old definition, although generally they would say that they're not, that they're two different organisms. There's the fungus and there's the algae, and they're separate in the old definition.
Yeah, I just looked up on Wikipedia. They call them composite organisms there. So it's
I don't
definitely
think
a
that's
spectrum.
waiting for Wikipedia. I love Wikipedia. It's just the best. Yeah, my students all write for Wikipedia.
Yeah, I agree.
So I have a question about, I guess, subjectivity maybe this is another one of those things that you say, I do not wish to comment, but I feel like an organism, right? Like I feel like I am this like cohesive me thing. And as biologists, we can look at other parts of life. We can look at beehives or man-o'-wars or whatever, and we can say that is or isn't an organism. I guess what I'm wondering is about the subjective experience of the organism. Like, can we say that a beehive has a subjective experience of being a hive, or is the only experience to be had at the level of bees? Or is that something we can talk about at all?
I would certainly need a glass of wine for that one. I mean, yeah. I'm kind of a down to earth sort of person. I don't know. I have no idea. Yes, why not? I mean, there is a what do they say? The wisdom of the hive. Isn't that one of Tom Seeley's books? I mean, there is a communal knowledge probably. So, yeah, I don't have a good answer for you, but it's interesting to think about.
Mel, sorry, I was. Yeah.
What?
Were you saying something?
Oh, I was just jumping in. Is now a good time to jump in?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
were you lag? Okay. Joan, do you have a sneaking suspicion about what makes humanity unique? Not in a rigorous way, but just like your intuitions, maybe.
Well, I guess the last time the world was truly spoiled was back when the what are they? The big oxygen transition about 4 billion years ago, right? When the Earth's atmosphere went from a no oxygen reducing atmosphere to a oxidizing atmosphere, and everything before, like the archaea, really kind of had to go hide, and there was a huge change. So humans are doing that level of stuff, one might say, to the planet now. So I'd say, like the blue-green algae, we are completely changing the planet. So we're not unique, but us and the blue-green algae are kind of up there for damage. I don't think humans are all that unique.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'm going to ask one more question. I know I made it speaking too much. Well, so Mel, you said something a while back actually about.
I can't hear you. Can anyone hear him?
Sorry, I had audio problem. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So one thing that I wanted to maybe hear you speak more about is you had this slide about the causes of organismality and then the products of organismality. And I thought that was a really good shift to make, that a lot of what you said, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, is that a lot of the hallmark features that we use to define organisms, continuity and genetic heritability and all the rest, that those aren't causes, they're effects of evolution, or effects of organismality rather. And if you're trying to look at adaptive forces that are causing these things, you want to look in slightly different places. And I really appreciated that distinction of like drawing a line between causes and effects on an evolutionary timescale. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
I mean, so my definition of organismality is focused on adaptation and what allows biological entities to become a pinnacle of adaptation for their constituent parts. And so it was just really things that allow essentially for that to be a unit and a cooperative unit, and that there's lots of ways of becoming a cooperative unit, not just one. So that's really all it is.
Okay, are there any final questions or comments for Joan before we conclude for the afternoon?
If I could just jump in, I've been like hanging on to this question for a while. Are there any like big changes or like, are there any changes you could think of that you would make to the new definition of organism, like according to your own definition of organism?
I like our definition of organism, and I'm pretty committed to it, but I think that there are it depends what your purpose is. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I study adaptation. So I have not too surprisingly embraced a definition which puts adaptation at the center and control of conflict below. I think it's a conceptually rigorous definition that you don't have to say, oh, well, there's these exceptions, like, you know, say it was indivisible, and then it's like, oh, but honeybee colonies they're divisible, but it's okay. So it doesn't have any of that, but it is hard to measure, you know, and it can be challenging in that way. And then, so the other thing I'd say is other people might have different reasons for having the concept of an organism or a species. So if you're doing phylogenetics and you're doing a phylogenetic tree, genetic contiguity would be really important. So you might have a different definition of organism there, just as the phylogeneticists have a definition of species that's different from some other people. If you're a developmental biologist, you might care about sort of developmental homogeneity. So I don't think science has a big place for dogma, for being dogmatic. And I think what it has a place for is really defining your terms and defining what it is your definition is useful for. So I'm interested in adaptation. This is one that works for adaptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I appreciate the pragmatism of everything you've said. It's you know,
I'm a mom. I have to be pragmatic.
Quick question. What was the name of the social scientist that you mentioned? I think Dan Arley?
A-R, never remember if it's I-E or E-I-L-Y.
Okay.
Yeah, he's pretty amazing. Really good.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving this talk. It was really gave me a lot to think about. So we'll be making videos about this talk and facets related to it. So I'll be sure to send you those when they are ready. And yeah, so when you leave, I'll stop the broadcast and then I'll just check in with the class and then we'll conclude.
Okay. How do I leave?
Just hit the X.
The X. Well, I just can.
There we go.